Hello and welcome to my first weekly devlog. In my last video, I began working on a first-person shooter, but I kind of want to change some stuff up and add some new physics interactions. My two favorite games of all time are Super Mario Galaxy and Bone Lab on the Oculus Quest 2, and the gameplay of both of those games is almost completely based around their physics. So naturally I'm a bit of an expert on that subject, but before I can go ahead adding cool physics stuff, I want to change up the graphics because right now the game looks really dark and also kind of green for some reason. And to do that I had to install Unity's URP package, which basically just allows me to have way better graphics and also add cool effects to the camera. At first this didn't work, and that's because I was using the regular 3D template in Unity, and instead I switched it over to the 3D URP template by exporting everything in the original project to a new one. And this had some weird side effects. Everything was purple, and also gravity was way too weak, and also none of my scripts worked, so I had to do a little bit of troubleshooting, but eventually I got everything working and looking correct. So now I wanted to play around with the graphics, and the first thing I did was add this thing called ambient occlusion, which basically just adds a little shadow around the edges of objects so that you can see them better, but it also kind of makes it look more stylized, and I thought it looked really cool, so I kept it in. And I also wanted to make the muzzle flash glow when you fire a weapon, so I added this effect called bloom, which basically just takes bright things in your game and makes them a whole lot brighter to the camera. So now the muzzle flash actually looks like a real explosion, and that's kind of what I was going for. Once I had graphics figured out, I really wanted to get into physics stuff, but before I did that, I wanted to change up the map a little bit, and so to make it more interesting, I made the floor reflective black color, and I also added some floating platforms around it. And the first physics thing that I wanted to experiment with was realistic destruction, and I thought it would be really cool if the player could smash through a wall into an area where there's a bunch of enemies, so I decided to make a breakable wall in Blender by taking a cube, scaling it around, and then cell-fracturing it. And once I'd done that, I brought it into Unity and gave each of the chunks of the wall their own collider and rigid body so that they could have their own physics. After I'd done that, I put together a simple script that whenever these chunks of wall would touch a certain kind of object, they would turn on their rigid body and get the physics that they need to actually act correctly. And at first I got it to work pretty well, but the pieces weren't flying in the correct direction, so I played around with the code that made it explode, and after a lot of troubleshooting I finally got my code to work so that the wall would explode correctly, and also that the pieces would fly in the direction your gun is facing at the time it shoots them, so that's a little bit more realistic that way. I also made it so that each of the pieces slowly shrinks and then disappears once they've been moved or blown out from their original position, and since I had realistic destruction in my game, I thought it would be really cool if I had explosions in there as well, so the first piece of inspiration I took was the exploding crate from Super Smash Bros. I wanted to make something that you could attack and then it would explode the moment you do, and so I went into Blender and I kind of made my own version of that. It doesn't look super good. It was kind of supposed to be like a wooden crate made out of white wood with a glowing red border around it. I'm not sure where I got that idea, but I think it looks pretty good. And then I made a warning sign in Blender that I forgot to put on there originally, and I also put that onto the crate as well. And now that I had the main visuals of the crate done, I started working on 3 different particle systems that would come together and create one big explosion effect. And these were the initial blast, the fire that comes after it, and then some smoke just to add a little bit of flair. And once I had all of those done, I added them all to a new game object called Explosion, and I also added an invisible ball to that game object so that whenever the player touches this invisible ball, they get launched away from it with an explosion force. And now every time the player jumps above the crate and shoots it, they will be sent flying upwards away from it. And I thought this was really cool, and I wanted to implement it somewhere else, so I did a little bit of research and I discovered a gameplay mechanic called rocket jumping, which is basically where the player shoots the ground next to them with a rocket launcher and gets sent in the opposite direction. So of course I needed a rocket launcher, and at first I thought it would be kind of funny if the player had like a gaming PC full of rockets. I don't know where that idea came from, but it ended up being a terrible one because the gaming PC was really huge in the player's view and it was really hard to see around it, and if you could see around it, it had to be really small, so it just didn't make any sense. But I didn't want to have wasted all of that time making a gaming PC in Blender, so I just gave it a rigid body and set it aside as a random prop. So I scrapped the gaming PC idea, and instead I just made a little block as a placeholder for the rocket launcher. And now I had to make the actual rockets, and at first I wanted to make them an actual physical object in the game, but that proved to be a very bad idea because all of the rockets were going in one direction, and for some reason they were swirling around in the sky, and I'm not even sure how that's physically possible, but they were doing that and it was a problem. And eventually my code for them got so messed up that they were literally flying around Cleetus, and that's the exact opposite of what I want them to do. So instead I just took the same script that I was using on my gun and tweaked it a little bit so that it could also work for a rocket launcher, and boom, I had the rocket launcher working well. So now the player is able to shoot anything nearby, and if they're in midair, they'll get sent flying away from the exact spot that they shot. The only issue is that the player could use this to blow up their face, and that created an infinite jump glitch, which I did not want in my game, and also it was super buggy and not very fun to play, so I tweaked the layers a bit and now the issue is gone. So all that's left is to make the map a little bit more interesting and also possible for the player to jump between walls using the new rocket jumping mechanic. There was only one slight issue, and it was that it was pretty hard to tell where the player is going if they're facing a wall just after a rocket jump, and it's really hard to tell exactly how fast you're moving. So to fix this, I thought it would be pretty helpful to have a little grid texture on all of the walls and floors, just so that the player could measure their movement a little bit better. And apparently to do this you need a shader material, and I've never worked in shaders before, and honestly I didn't even know what they were until I started working on this, but I found a tutorial by Mina Pachot on YouTube, and I definitely just butchered your name, sorry about that, but after a little bit of time I got a global shader working so that I could move any object I want anywhere that I want, and the grid would still line up perfectly. The only thing left to do was to give the rocket launcher an actual model for itself, so I went into Blender and I kind of came up with this idea called the flip gun, which is basically just a rocket launcher on one side and a shotgun on the other side, and basically the idea is that the player can flip it in their hand and then switch whichever weapon it is. So I brought that into Unity and boom, it worked perfectly. As a final touch, I noticed that once Cleetus was dead, it was impossible to really do anything because the entire goal of the game, which is kind of just to kill him, is now gone. So I made a little Cleetus spawner, and if you use the pistol to shoot the red button next to it, it spawns a new Cleetus. So now if you ever run out of Kleenexes, you can just shoot the button and spawn as many as you want, as long as that's less than 20. If you want to play the game in its current state, you can at the itch.io link down below. You just have to download the zip file and then extract it and play the game. And if you have any suggestions about the gameplay, let me know in the comments below. I'm very open to advice on this. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers!